The eviction notice wasn't what shocked William. It was the date on the agreement. For years, Camilla's relatives had been using a royal cottage under an arrangement everyone inside the palace seemed to accept. Staff maintained it. Security covered it. And nobody questioned who actually had the right to live there. Until William ordered a routine review. The lawyers expected to find a simple occupancy agreement. Instead, they found something that made them reopen records going back decades. The permission allowing Camilla's family to use the cottage had apparently expired. Camilla insisted Charles had personally guaranteed their right to remain. So William asked one question. Then show me where he had the authority to give it to them. That was when the lawyers stopped examining the occupancy agreement and started examining the original ownership documents. What they discovered turned a family disagreement into something far bigger. Because the real question wasn't whether Camilla's family had permission to stay. It was whether the cottage had ever belonged to the people who gave them permission in the first place. And when William finally saw the name buried inside the oldest document, he ordered the cottage frozen immediately. Before we reveal the name the lawyers discovered, hit like, subscribe, and tell us, which city are you watching from? The cottage wasn't supposed to become a problem. For years, members of Camilla's family had used the property without anyone inside the palace seriously questioning the arrangement. The grounds were maintained. Security knew who came and went. Expenses appeared in the appropriate files. Everything looked completely ordinary, until William ordered a routine review of royal residences. It wasn't aimed at Camilla. It wasn't even focused on the cottage. William simply wanted advisors to identify which properties were occupied, who was responsible for them, and what agreements remained active. Then one advisor stopped at a single file. "Sir, there's something wrong with this one." William looked up. "What?" The advisor turned the document around. It concerned the cottage being used by Camilla's relatives. William wasn't surprised. "They have permission." "They did." William paused. "Did?" The advisor pointed toward the bottom of the agreement. There was an expiration date. William read it once. Then again. The arrangement should already have ended. Why are they still there? Nobody answered. William looked toward the property secretary. Was it renewed? No renewal could immediately be found. Was there another agreement? Again, nothing. William's expression hardened. He wasn't prepared to order anyone out based on incomplete paperwork. Get the lawyers. Within an hour, the original occupancy agreement was on the table. A senior lawyer began examining every clause. William expected him to focus on the expiration date. Instead, the lawyer suddenly stopped near the first page. His expression changed. "What is it?" The lawyer looked back through the document, then pulled the property's registration file closer. "Sir, the expiration date may not be our biggest problem." William frowned. "Then what is?" The lawyer pointed to the section identifying who had granted permission for Camilla's family to occupy the cottage. Something was missing. No crown estate ownership. No clear royal property designation. William stared at the page. "Who owns the cottage?" The lawyer slowly closed the file. "That's precisely what this agreement doesn't tell us." Camilla's response came faster than William expected. By the time the lawyers began tracing the cottage's ownership, she already knew the occupancy agreement was being questioned. And she wasn't worried. "There is another document." William looked at her. "What document?" Camilla explained that Charles had personally approved her family's continued use of the cottage years earlier. Not verbally, not through an informal conversation. In writing. Within hours, an old letter was retrieved from Camilla's private files. She placed it directly in front of William. "There." William began reading. The language appeared clear. Charles had authorized members of Camilla's family to continue using the cottage and had instructed palace staff to respect the arrangement. For a moment, the entire dispute seemed finished. Camilla leaned back. "My family didn't simply decide to stay there." William nodded. Nobody was accusing them of that. But the senior lawyer hadn't stopped reading. He moved slowly through the letter, then returned to the first paragraph. "There's a problem." Camilla's expression changed. "What problem?" The lawyer pointed toward one sentence. Charles had granted permission to occupy and use the cottage. But nowhere in the letter did he identify himself, or the crown, as its legal owner. William immediately understood the distinction. Charles could promise access only if he had the authority to grant that access in the first place. Camilla disagreed. He was the king. The lawyer remained careful. That doesn't automatically make every property associated with the royal family personally his to dispose of. Silence. William picked up the original occupancy agreement, then Charles's letter. 2 different documents, 2 different dates, but both contained the same strange omission. Neither clearly established who owned the cottage. William pushed the papers toward the lawyers. Forget who was allowed to live there. Camilla looked at him. William's next instruction changed the entire investigation. I want the original deed. The senior lawyer nodded. William leaned back. Before we discuss removing anyone, answer one question. He looked directly at Camilla. Who actually owns this house? And when the oldest property records finally arrived, the name on the deed wasn't the one anyone expected. The oldest property file arrived the following morning. William expected it to settle everything. Instead, it made the situation worse. The senior lawyer placed 3 documents side by side. The modern property register, Charles's written permission, and the original deed. William looked at them. Well, the lawyer pointed toward the modern record. For years, the cottage has been administered as though it sits within the wider royal property structure. Camilla folded her arms. Exactly. Then the lawyer touched the original deed. But this says something different. William leaned forward. The cottage had once been transferred separately from the surrounding properties. Not sold in the ordinary sense. Not permanently absorbed into the wider estate. Instead, it had been placed under an unusual family arrangement with restrictions attached. William frowned. What restrictions? The lawyer turned the page. One clause prevented the property from being permanently transferred outside a particular family line. Another limited who could authorize long-term occupation. Then came the strangest part. Charles's name wasn't there. Neither was Camilla's. William looked up. So my father could let someone use it. Possibly temporarily, the lawyer said. But he couldn't simply give away rights he didn't personally own. Camilla immediately objected. Charles wasn't giving it away. No, William replied. But somebody allowed your family to remain after the original permission expired. Nobody answered. The lawyer continued examining the deed. Then he found a handwritten reference beside the transfer clause. A second document was mentioned. Family continuation schedule. Where is that? William asked. The archivist searched the folder. Nothing. Another box was opened. Still nothing. The schedule was missing. William's frustration grew. What does it contain? The lawyer looked again at the deed. Based on this language, probably the names of the people for whom the cottage was meant to be preserved. The room went silent. Camilla stared at the document. William asked the obvious question. Who? The lawyer couldn't answer. Button could. When she was shown the deed later that afternoon, she recognized the arrangement immediately. And before William could explain what they were searching for, and said, "You're missing a page," and didn't need much time with the deed. She read the first page, then the second, and immediately looked at William. "You're missing a page." William frowned. The lawyers already noticed. "No," and replied, "I mean I remember the page." That changed everything. William pulled out a chair. "What do you remember?" And explained that decades earlier, several smaller royal residences had been treated differently from the major palaces and estates. Some weren't meant to become permanent homes for whoever happened to receive permission to use them. They were preserved for a purpose, for the family members who came next. William looked toward the cottage deed. "This one?" and nodded. "I believe so." Camilla remained skeptical. "You believe?" and ignored the tone. She remembered seeing the continuation schedule during an earlier family property discussion. It contained names, conditions, and instructions governing what happened when one generation gave way to another. William leaned forward. "Whose names?" and paused. "I don't remember." Camilla almost smiled, and wasn't finished. "I remember something else." She pointed toward the handwritten reference on the deed. The missing schedule wasn't originally stored with the property papers. It had been placed inside a separate family archive because it dealt with beneficiaries, not ordinary property administration. William immediately turned toward the archivist. "Find it." The search began. Boxes were reopened. Old indexes were checked. Then an archivist discovered a reference to a sealed folder transferred years earlier. William asked for it immediately, but when the folder arrived, there was another surprise. The continuation schedule wasn't the only document inside. There was also an old instruction explaining why the cottage had been protected from permanent reassignment, and recognized the handwriting. William noticed her expression. "What?" and slowly looked up. This wasn't meant to be just another royal residence. William opened the folder. The first page contained the missing schedule. and beneath the original beneficiary section was a provision for the next generation. William began reading, then stopped, because the cottage hadn't simply been preserved for another royal. It had been preserved for a family line that eventually led directly to his own children. Camilla had heard enough. By the time William returned from the archive meeting, she was already waiting for him. The missing schedule had changed the investigation, and Camilla knew exactly where it appeared to be heading. "You're throwing my family out." William stopped. "I haven't thrown anyone out. Not yet." Camilla placed Charles's letter on the table. "My family entered that cottage with your father's permission. They maintained it. They paid expenses. They treated it responsibly." William nodded. "I know. Then why are lawyers digging through documents from decades ago?" William looked directly at her. "Because permission isn't ownership." Camilla's expression hardened. "This isn't about paperwork, William. What is it about?" "Me." Silence. Camilla accused him of searching for a technicality because the occupants happened to be connected to her. William didn't raise his voice. Instead, he opened the newly recovered folder. "If these documents say your family has the right to remain, they remain." Camilla paused. "And if they don't, then we follow the documents." She pushed another file toward him. Receipts, repairs, maintenance costs, money her relatives had spent on the cottage over the years. They invested in that home. William examined them. The lawyer beside him nodded. The payments appeared genuine. For a moment, Camilla seemed to have found her strongest argument. Then the lawyer spoke. "Maintenance may support reimbursement or another claim." Camilla looked at him. "But it doesn't automatically create ownership." Her face fell. Then the door opened. The archivist entered carrying the missing continuation schedule and had remembered. Nobody spoke. He placed it in front of William. William opened the first page. Older names, transfer conditions, restrictions. Then he reached the next generation provision. His expression changed. Camilla noticed immediately. "What does it say?" William didn't answer. He turned another page. 3 names appeared beneath the beneficiary clause. George, Charlotte, Louis. Camilla stared at them. But before William could say anything, the lawyer raised his hand. "Don't issue an eviction notice yet." William looked up. "Why?" The lawyer pointed back toward Charles's letter. "Because even if William's children were the beneficiaries, Camilla's family might still have one legal argument capable of keeping them inside the cottage." William kept staring at the 3 names. George, Charlotte, Louis. For the first time, the cottage dispute had reached his own children. Camilla looked at the document. "So that's it." William glanced toward her. "You've decided my family has to leave because their names are written there?" "No," the senior lawyer interrupted. Everyone turned toward him. He pulled Charles's letter back across the table. "The beneficiaries establish who the property was preserved for. They don't necessarily tell us when existing occupants must leave." William frowned. "Explain." The lawyer pointed toward Charles's authorization. Camilla's relatives had entered the cottage legally. There was no evidence they had forced their way into the property or knowingly ignored the original arrangement. Charles had given them permission. The question was whether that permission remained valid after the next generation provision became active. Camilla immediately seized on it. "So they can stay?" "Possibly." William remained silent. The lawyer compared the 2 documents. One contained Charles's permission. The other protected the cottage for William's children. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then the lawyer noticed something. A phrase appeared in both documents. "Subject to existing family provisions." He read it again. Charles's permission hadn't overridden the older arrangement. It had been issued under it. William leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means His Majesty could authorize temporary occupation." Camilla waited. "But..." The lawyer turned to the continuation schedule. He could not extend that occupation beyond the date on which the next generation provision became active. Silence. William looked at the date, then at his children's names. "When did that happen?" The lawyer began calculating from the condition written into the schedule. His expression changed. Camilla noticed. "What?" He placed his finger beside the triggering date. The room went completely still. The problem wasn't that Camilla's family's permission was about to expire. It wasn't even that it had expired recently. According to the original arrangement, their right to remain in the cottage may have ended years ago. William slowly looked toward Charles's letter, and suddenly the question became unavoidable. Who had allowed them to stay after that? The date changed everything. William looked from the continuation schedule to Charles's letter. Years ago, the lawyer nodded. According to the original arrangement, Camilla's relatives had entered the cottage legally. Charles had every reason to believe he could authorize their temporary use of it. But his permission contained one crucial limitation, subject to existing family provisions. William pointed toward the words. So when the next generation clause activated, the temporary permission should have ended. Camilla immediately objected. Then why did nobody tell them? Nobody had an answer. No eviction notice had been issued. No formal warning had been sent. The cottage continued to be maintained. Security continued recognizing the occupants. From Camilla's family's perspective, nothing had changed. William looked toward the lawyer. Does that mean their continued residence became valid? Not necessarily. That answer caught everyone's attention. The lawyer explained that administrative silence could create confusion. It could even strengthen arguments for a reasonable transition period. But it couldn't automatically rewrite the underlying property arrangement. Camilla folded her arms. So after all these years, William can simply tell them to leave? The lawyer shook his head. Not simply. There would need to be formal notice. Time to relocate. Potential consideration of documented expenses. And absolute clarity that the original arrangement genuinely controlled the property. William nodded. Then that's what we'll do. Camilla stared at him. You've already decided. No. William closed Charles's letter. The documents decided years ago. Nobody acted on them. That distinction made Camilla even angrier. Her family hadn't secretly occupied the cottage. They had remained because the palace itself had failed to enforce its own records. William understood that, which was why he refused to turn the correction into a public humiliation. Then the lawyer placed one final document before him. Notice of return of possession. William read it carefully. He picked up the pen. But before signing, he changed one line. No immediate removal. No security escort. A reasonable period to leave voluntarily. William signed. Then he stood. I'm telling them myself. Camilla's expression changed. Because William wasn't sending lawyers. He wasn't sending staff. He was taking the eviction notice directly to her family. William refused to let palace staff deliver it. The lawyers had prepared the paperwork. The deadline had been checked. The transition period had been added. But William believed one part of this had to come from him. He arrived at the cottage carrying a single folder. Camilla was already there. So were the relatives who had been living in the property. Nobody offered small talk. William placed the folder on the table. I wanted you to hear this from me. One of Camilla's relatives looked at the document. Are you evicting us? William paused. I'm asking you to return a property your agreement no longer gives you the right to occupy. Camilla immediately stepped forward. That's an eviction. William didn't argue over the word. Instead, he opened the folder. First came Charles's letter. You were given permission to live here. Then the original property arrangement. You did nothing wrong by accepting it. Next came the continuation schedule. But that permission had a limit. William pointed toward the triggering date. The room went silent. Camilla's relative stared at it. Nobody told us. I know. William's answer surprised everyone. There was no accusation of deliberate wrongdoing. No claim that Camilla's family had knowingly taken someone else's home. The palace had failed too. William admitted it. You should have been informed when this changed. Then he placed the formal notice on the table. They would be given time. No immediate removal. No humiliating escort from the property. Documented expenses would be reviewed separately. But the cottage had to be returned. Camilla looked furious. You've already made your decision. The documents made it. No, William. Camilla stepped closer. You did. Then she asked the question that stopped him. If these people were connected to Diana instead of me, would you still be standing here with that notice? Nobody moved. William looked directly at Camilla. He didn't hesitate. Yes. But Camilla wasn't finished. She pointed toward the cottage. Then prove this is about ownership and not about me. William opened the folder again. And the final document inside was about to do exactly that. William didn't look away. Camilla had challenged him directly. Prove this is about ownership and not about me. William opened the folder. Then he removed the one document he hadn't shown them yet. It was the original instruction explaining why the cottage had been protected in the first place. He placed it in front of Camilla. Read it. Camilla hesitated. Then she looked down. The language was surprisingly clear. The cottage wasn't preserved as a reward. It wasn't intended to become anyone's permanent private residence. It had been protected so that future generations of the designated family line would always have access to a smaller, private home away from the larger royal estates. Camilla stopped reading. William pointed toward the beneficiary schedule. George, Charlotte, Louis, this isn't becoming my house. Camilla looked up. Then what are you doing with it? Returning it to the purpose it was protected for. That changed the argument. William wasn't removing Camilla's relatives so he could move into the cottage himself. He wasn't planning to sell it. He wasn't even assigning it immediately to one of his children. The property would simply return to the arrangement the palace had failed to follow. Camilla remained quiet. Then she asked, "And my family?" William softened. "They get time. No security officers arriving at dawn. No belongings placed outside. No public spectacle. The documented maintenance expenses would also be reviewed fairly." Camilla's anger didn't disappear, but the confrontation had changed. "You really would have done this to Diana's family?" William answered immediately. "If they had no continuing right to the property, yes." Then the senior lawyer stepped forward. "There is one more page." William turned. The lawyer handed him the final part of the original instruction. William began reading. His expression changed, and had been right about the cottage being more than another residence. There was a specific reason the property had been kept small, private, and protected from permanent reassignment. And when William reached the final paragraph, he understood why his children's names had eventually appeared in the documents. Because whoever created this arrangement hadn't been protecting a valuable house. They had been protecting something the royal family rarely possessed at all: privacy. William read the final paragraph again. Suddenly, the entire dispute looked different. For days, everyone had focused on ownership. Camilla's family believed Charles had given them the right to remain. The palace had treated the cottage like another royal residence. William's lawyers had searched deeds, agreements, and forgotten schedules trying to establish who controlled it. But the original purpose was surprisingly simple. The cottage had been preserved as a private refuge for the next generation. Not a palace, not an investment, not a permanent reward for any particular member of the family. A home where future descendants could escape the machinery surrounding royal life. William looked again at the beneficiary schedule. George, Charlotte, Louis. Now those names made sense. The property wasn't being handed to William personally. It had been protected for his children's generation. Camilla slowly closed the document. "So my family really has to leave." William nodded. "But not today. There would be time. Expenses would be reviewed. And nobody would be publicly humiliated for a mistake created partly by years of poor palace administration." Camilla looked toward her relatives, then back at William. For once, she didn't argue. Weeks later, the final belongings were carried through the cottage door. Camilla stood outside holding a bag, visibly emotional. William was there too. But there was no celebration, no victory. He simply watched the keys being returned. Then one of the lawyers handed them to him. William immediately handed them back. "Keep them with the property office." The lawyer looked surprised. "You don't want them?" William shook his head. "It isn't my home." That was the final twist. William hadn't fought to take the cottage for himself. He had fought to restore the arrangement everyone else had forgotten. The investigation began with an expired occupancy agreement. It uncovered Charles's promise, a missing schedule, 3 unexpected names, and finally, the truth. The question had never really been, who lives here? It was, who was this home being protected for? And after decades of confusion, the original documents finally answered it. The cottage belonged to the future, not to the people who happened to be living there today.